The crisp winter air in Vancouver crackled with energy as thousands of spectators, dignitaries, and competitors gathered for the highly anticipated 2025 Invictus Games. The event had always been a beacon of resilience, a celebration of the human spirit triumphing over adversity. Flags waved high, and the sound of cheers echoed through the arena as athletes prepared to compete in one of the most grueling and exhilarating sports of the Games, the skeleton finals. Among the high-profile attendees were Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, a couple whose very presence seemed to command attention wherever they went. Since stepping back from their royal duties years ago, they had remained a subject of endless fascination, their every move scrutinized, dissected, and debated. Some saw them as trailblazers carving out a new path beyond the confines of royal tradition, while others viewed them as controversial figures entangled in self-made storms. But on this particular day, as cameras panned across the audience capturing luminaries and spectators alike, no one could have predicted the dramatic and deeply personal moment about to unfold between the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. It began subtly, an exchange that, at first glance, might have seemed like nothing more than an ordinary discussion. Meghan had been engaged in an animated conversation with a member of Team UK, her face radiating enthusiasm, her gestures exuding confidence. The athlete she spoke to nodded along, seemingly engrossed in whatever she was saying. Prince Harry stood beside her, watching the interaction with a polite but distant expression. His presence had been quieter that day, his usual charm slightly subdued. Those who had followed his journey through the Invictus Games knew that this event was more than just a commitment. It was his passion, his legacy, a project born from his unwavering dedication to wounded veterans. And yet, as Meghan continued speaking, a shift in Harry's demeanor became apparent. He moved slightly closer, as if about to interject, his lips parting as though he had something to add. Perhaps it was a simple comment, an anecdote, or even a gentle reminder of the event's schedule. But whatever words were about to leave his mouth never had the chance to materialize. What happened next stunned everyone. In a swift, almost reflexive motion, Meghan turned toward him with a look that could cut through steel. The exact sequence of events varied depending on which angle one viewed the footage from, but the most shocking version was the one captured by a camera positioned directly across from them. Meghan's hand, with a sharp flick of her wrist, made contact with Harry's face. The slap was not forceful enough to knock him off balance, but it was unmistakable. The sound, though barely audible over the noise of the crowd, was enough to send a jolt of electricity through those standing nearby. A gasp rippled through the immediate circle around them, with onlookers unsure whether they had truly just witnessed what they thought they had. A security staff member standing a few feet away instinctively shifted, his body tensing as if preparing to intervene. Harry, for his part, did not lash out. He did not retaliate. He did not even speak. Instead, his face went blank, a mask of practiced composure overtaking whatever emotions had threatened to surface. For a fleeting moment, there was something unmistakably vulnerable in his expression. Hurt, confusion, perhaps even disbelief. And then, without a word, he turned and walked away. The footage captured his exit in excruciating detail. His stride was steady but uncharacteristically brisk, his shoulders squared but visibly stiff. It was not the composed departure of a man in control, but the quiet retreat of someone who had just endured a moment of deep humiliation. The cameras followed his movements as he wove through the event grounds, away from the crowded arena, disappearing into one of the restricted areas designated for officials and high-profile guests. Within minutes, whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs erupted into full-fledged speculation. Social media exploded with real-time reactions. Some refused to believe what they had seen. Others were quick to rationalize, suggesting that perhaps it had been nothing more than a misunderstood gesture, a moment blown out of proportion by eager onlookers. And yet, the video evidence remained, spreading like wildfire across news outlets and online platforms. For those who had long suspected tensions within the Sussex household, this moment was the confirmation they had been waiting for. But for others, the incident raised more questions than answers. What had led to such a public fallout between Harry and Meghan? Was this a single, isolated incident, or merely the latest crack in an already fragile foundation? And most importantly, what would happen next? As the hours passed, the atmosphere at the Invictus Games remained celebratory on the surface, but beneath the facade, a storm was brewing. Attendees exchanged knowing glances, journalists scrambled for statements, and body language experts were already dissecting the footage frame by frame. Would Harry return to Meghan's side, brushing off the moment as if nothing had happened? Or was this the beginning of something far more significant, a moment that could redefine the course of their relationship in the public eye? The world watched and waited, hanging on to every detail, as the truth behind the shocking encounter began to unravel. The buzz around the stadium grew louder as the incident settled into the air like an unspoken secret. There was something surreal about it, a moment that had happened in real time but felt almost cinematic in its execution. Prince Harry's abrupt departure left a gaping void in his wake, and even those who had been too far to witness the exchange directly could sense the disturbance. It was as if an invisible crack had just splintered through the carefully crafted image of unity and composure that the couple had spent years curating. Yet, amid the murmurs and stolen glances, Meghan Markle remained in place, her posture unwavering, her expression composed. It was as though nothing had happened, as if the eyes of the world weren't now dissecting her every move. She turned back toward the Team UK athlete she had been speaking with just moments before, her voice steady, her manner unaffected. But something had changed. The athlete, whose identity would later become the subject of speculation, appeared momentarily disoriented, their gaze flickering between Meghan and the direction where Prince Harry had just vanished. The conversation, once effortless and engaged, had lost its rhythm. Meghan, however, carried on, steering the dialogue as if it had never been interrupted. For those unfamiliar with the subtleties of high-profile body language, it might have seemed like nothing more than a minor disagreement, a momentary misunderstanding between husband and wife. But to those who had followed Meghan and Harry's journey from the beginning, to the seasoned analyst who had scrutinized their every public appearance, this was different. This wasn't the controlled, media-savvy Meghan who knew precisely how to navigate public scrutiny. This wasn't the Harry who had once been the heart of royal charm and resilience. This was something else entirely. And in that something else, a new narrative was beginning to form. Behind the scenes, security personnel and event organizers scrambled to assess the situation. This was an international event, and every movement, every interaction, had to be carefully managed. One of the event coordinators, a middle-aged man with a headset permanently attached to his ear, had been following the couple's presence throughout the day. He had noted their arrival, their seating arrangements, their interactions with guests. But nothing had prepared him for what he had just witnessed. He pressed his earpiece closer. "Get eyes on Prince Harry," he instructed quietly. "Make sure he's all right." The directive was vague, yet the urgency in his voice was unmistakable. Elsewhere, a media frenzy was already taking shape. Journalists who had been focused on covering the Invictus Games were suddenly rewriting their headlines, redirecting their attention from the triumphs of the athletes to the drama unfolding behind the scenes. One particular camera operator, a veteran in the industry, had instinctively followed Harry's exit, capturing every tense moment of his departure. It was footage that, within hours, would become the most talked-about clip on social media. The video showed Harry moving with purpose, yet carrying the weight of something unseen. His hands remained at his sides, clenched subtly, his jaw tight. He passed several Invictus Games staff members, each one registering a look of concern but refraining from stopping him. The first sign that something deeper was happening came when Harry reached a secluded corridor leading to the event's VIP lounge. It was there that he momentarily paused, his fingers brushing against the bridge of his nose as he exhaled sharply. A man who had spent years perfecting the art of maintaining composure in public now found himself in a moment of raw vulnerability. A photographer stationed nearby hesitated, unsure whether to capture the moment. There was an ethical line that many in the media understood. They could document public figures, but moments of private anguish were often off-limits. Yet, at the same time, this was a public event, and Prince Harry, a man who had once lived within the tightly guarded walls of the British monarchy, had chosen a life of transparency. The camera clicked. Back inside the stadium, Meghan's demeanor remained unchanged. Whether she was aware of the cameras capturing her every move, or whether she simply did not care, was uncertain. But what was undeniable was that she had just made one of the most public statements of her life. Not through words, but through action. And that action had sent shockwaves through the royal watching world. The question that now burned in everyone's mind was not just what had happened, but what it meant. For years, the dynamics between Meghan and Harry had been the subject of endless debate. Many had championed their decision to step away from the royal family, framing it as an act of independence, of reclaiming control over their own narrative. Others had criticized their choices, painting them as reckless, ungrateful, or even self-destructive. But this was different. This was no carefully curated interview, no Netflix special, no written statement crafted by PR professionals. This was raw, unfiltered, and irreversible. The very existence of the footage meant that there was no turning back. As the hours stretched on, the narrative began to take shape across news outlets and social media platforms. Some defended Meghan, insisting that whatever had happened was being exaggerated, that perhaps the slap had been more of a dismissive gesture rather than an act of aggression. Others were not so forgiving. Among those analyzing the footage were body language experts, relationship specialists, and media commentators, each offering their take on what had transpired. "Look at the way Harry reacts," one expert pointed out during a live broadcast on a leading news channel. "He doesn't retaliate. He doesn't argue. He simply walks away. That suggests a level of resignation. This isn't a one-time incident. This is something he's familiar with." Another commentator disagreed. "We don't know what was said. We don't know the context." Meghan could have been frustrated, and the motion could have been misinterpreted. But the debate over intent did not change the reality of what people had seen. The royal family, famously silent in moments of controversy, was said to be monitoring the situation closely. Sources from inside Buckingham Palace hinted that King Charles was already aware of the incident, though no official statement was expected. Prince William, whose relationship with Harry had been strained for years, was reportedly less than surprised by the development. "He's made his choices," an unnamed source close to the future king was quoted as saying. "Now he has to live with them." But living with them was proving to be more complicated than ever for Prince Harry. As the evening settled in, new questions arose. Where was he now? Would he return to Meghan's side? And if he did, what message would that send? More importantly, was this the breaking point that many had long predicted? For now, there were no answers. Only speculation, unfolding in real time, as the world watched and waited. As the world processed the shocking moment that had just unfolded at the Invictus Games, the tension behind the scenes only grew more palpable. While Meghan Markle maintained her composure in the public eye, Prince Harry's sudden exit had not gone unnoticed by those closest to him. It was not just the cameras that had captured his retreat. It was the athletes, the event staff, and even a few dignitaries who had seen the distress etched across his face as he walked away. Security teams assigned to high-profile guests had already been alerted to his movements. Though Harry was no longer an active member of the royal family, his status as a public figure meant that he was never truly alone in moments like this. His personal security detail, trained to observe without interfering, followed him at a respectful distance as he made his way to a more secluded part of the venue. One of the event organizers, a woman in her 50s who had worked closely with Harry since the inception of the Invictus Games, hesitated before making a decision. She had known him long enough to understand when something was wrong. This was not the usual strain of public life weighing on him. This was something deeper. She signaled discreetly to a staff member nearby. "Has anyone checked on him?" she asked in a hushed tone. The staff member shook his head. "Not yet. He's in one of the VIP lounges, but he hasn't spoken to anyone." The organizer nodded, pressing her lips together. She didn't want to overstep, but something about the way he had walked off unsettled her. Prince Harry had always been known for his ability to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders while keeping a brave face. But this time, something had cracked. And if there was one thing she knew, it was that even the strongest people had their breaking points. Meanwhile, inside the lounge, Harry stood near a set of floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the event grounds. The distant roar of the crowd was muffled by the thick glass, but the energy of the event still lingered in the air. He had spent years dedicating himself to this cause, pouring his heart into these games, ensuring that the veterans who had sacrificed so much had a place to shine. And yet, in this moment, he felt entirely removed from it all. He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers gripping the back of his neck as he tried to steady himself. It wasn't just the embarrassment of what had happened. It was the overwhelming sense of isolation that was beginning to settle over him. A quiet knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He turned slightly but didn't respond. The knock came again, followed by a hesitant voice. "Sir?" It was one of the event coordinators, a man Harry recognized but didn't know well. "Everything all right?" the man asked. Harry let out a slow exhale before turning to face him. "Yeah," he said, his voice lower than usual. "Just needed a moment." The coordinator nodded, clearly aware that this was not a situation that required pressing. "Understood. Let me know if you need anything." Harry gave a small nod, and the man stepped back, leaving him alone once more. Outside the lounge, the media machine was already in full motion. Journalists were scrambling for exclusive details, dissecting every available frame of footage, and contacting sources for any additional context. Theories ranged from minor marital disagreements to full-blown crisis speculation. One particular news anchor, broadcasting live from the event, leaned forward as she addressed her audience. "What we've just witnessed today is unprecedented. While public figures often have disagreements, it is incredibly rare to see something of this nature play out in front of cameras. What does this mean for Harry and Meghan moving forward? And more importantly, will there be any response from the Sussex camp?" Theories flooded social media, with hashtags related to the incident dominating the trending charts. Some users expressed concern for Harry, calling the moment a clear display of deeper troubles behind closed doors. Others leaped to Meghan's defense, insisting that the incident was being blown out of proportion. But in the midst of the online chaos, one thing remained clear. This was not a moment that could be easily erased or forgotten. Meanwhile, back at the main event, Meghan had continued with her public duties, seamlessly transitioning from her conversation with the Team UK athlete to interacting with other attendees. To the casual observer, she appeared unbothered, entirely in control. Her posture was poised, her smile intact, her voice steady. But those who knew her well, those who had worked with her closely, could see the subtle shifts. The slight tightness around her jaw, the way she occasionally glanced toward the direction where Harry had walked off, the extra effort she was putting into maintaining her usual charm. She was performing, as she always had. But this time, there was a crack in the facade. A royal correspondent station near the couple's seating area noted the atmosphere with interest. "What we are seeing here is an extraordinary display of contrast. Meghan Markle is carrying on as though nothing has happened, while Prince Harry has removed himself entirely from the situation. That alone tells us that whatever occurred between them was significant enough to impact his presence at his own event." As the speculation continued, another important question began to surface. What would the royal family make of this? Inside Buckingham Palace, news of the incident had already reached key members of the monarchy. While no official statements had been released, sources close to the palace hinted that the footage was under review. Prince William, whose relationship with Harry had been strained for years, was reportedly keeping a close eye on the developments. A former royal aide, speaking anonymously to a journalist, remarked, "The palace does not intervene in personal matters between the Sussexes, but this is different. The fact that this happened in such a public setting means that it cannot simply be ignored. There will be discussions behind closed doors, and those discussions may have long-term consequences." Back in Vancouver, the energy of the games continued, but the focus had undeniably shifted. Conversations that should have been centered around the inspiring performances of the athletes were now revolving around the unexpected drama that had unfolded. A veteran participating in the games, speaking candidly to a reporter, expressed his disappointment. "This event is supposed to be about us, the veterans, the competitors, the people who have worked so hard to be here. But now, all anyone is talking about is what happened between Harry and Meghan. It's a shame, really." Despite the attempts to maintain normalcy, the undercurrent of tension remained. Security teams had been briefed to monitor the couple's movements, ensuring that no further incidents would occur in front of cameras. Event organizers discreetly adjusted schedules to minimize any unnecessary interactions that could draw further attention. As the evening approached, another question loomed over the situation. Would Prince Harry return to Meghan's side before the night ended, or had the incident created an irreparable divide? The world waited for the answer. As night fell over Vancouver, the energy within the Invictus Games venue remained electric, but the undercurrent of tension was undeniable. The scheduled events continued without interruption, and the competitors, many of whom had trained for years for this very moment, pushed forward, determined not to let the unexpected drama overshadow their achievements. But no matter how much the organizers tried to maintain the focus on the athletes, it was clear that the real story was unfolding behind the scenes. For Prince Harry, the solitude of the VIP lounge provided little solace. He had always been a man of action, someone who thrived in the company of fellow veterans, finding camaraderie and purpose in their shared experiences. But at this moment, he felt utterly alone. The weight of the incident pressed against him like an invisible force, suffocating and unrelenting. He had never expected to find himself in a situation like this. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain composed under pressure, to navigate the complexities of public life with a sense of humor and resilience. But there was no way to laugh this off, no way to dismiss it as a misunderstanding. The cameras had captured everything, and the world was watching. A part of him wanted to reach for his phone, to check the headlines, to see what was being said. But he knew better. The internet was ruthless, and social media was an unforgiving beast. Instead, he closed his eyes, taking a slow, measured breath. His mind drifted back to his childhood, to the days when he had learned to suppress his emotions, to keep his pain buried beneath the surface. He had been taught that the world did not have patience for vulnerability, that the only way to survive in the public eye was to maintain control at all times. And yet, here he was, standing in the shadows of an event he had built from the ground up, feeling more exposed than ever. Outside the lounge, event organizers continued to monitor the situation. Several high-profile guests had discreetly inquired about Harry's whereabouts, their concern evident. While many were hesitant to get involved in what was clearly a personal matter, there was an unspoken agreement that something needed to be done. One of the senior members of the Invictus Games team finally made a decision. He approached a security officer stationed nearby and spoke in a low voice. "We need to check on him. Make sure he's all right." The security officer nodded, immediately moving toward the VIP lounge. He knocked once, waiting for a response. When none came, he tried again. "Sir? It's security. Just making sure everything is okay." A few seconds passed before the door finally opened. Harry stood there, his expression unreadable. "I'm fine," he said, his voice even. "Just needed a moment." The security officer hesitated before nodding. "Understood. If you need anything, we're here." Harry gave a small nod before closing the door once more. Meanwhile, Meghan Markle remained at the center of attention, her demeanor unchanged. If the incident had rattled her, she showed no signs of it. She continued to engage with guests, posing for photographs, exchanging pleasantries, and maintaining the polished exterior she had perfected over the years. But behind the scenes, her team was working furiously to control the narrative. Her personal assistant, an experienced media strategist, was already in damage control mode, coordinating with key contacts in the press to ensure that the story did not spiral out of control. One of the messages sent to a well-known journalist read simply, "The situation is being misrepresented. Let's discuss framing before anything goes to print." Despite their efforts, the damage had already been done. News outlets across the globe had picked up the story, and it was spreading like wildfire. One of the most widely circulated headlines read, "Cameras catch shocking moment as Meghan Markle slaps Prince Harry at Invictus Games." Another, from a more sympathetic source, framed it differently. "Tense exchange between Harry and Meghan sparks speculation." What really happened? Regardless of the wording, the story was everywhere. And for the first time in a long while, Harry and Meghan were not in control of the narrative. Inside Buckingham Palace, senior royal advisors were closely monitoring the situation. While the royal family had long adopted a policy of silence when it came to Harry and Meghan's controversies, this particular incident posed a new challenge. It was no longer just about media speculation or unverified reports. There was video evidence, and that made it nearly impossible to ignore. A senior aide, speaking on condition of anonymity, shared insights with a trusted journalist. There is genuine concern about how this will affect Harry's standing, both personally and professionally. The Invictus Games are his passion project, and this is not the kind of attention the event needs. Across the Atlantic, in Montecito, California, the reaction among those in Harry and Meghan's inner circle was mixed. Some were already strategizing ways to spin the situation in Meghan's favor, while others privately expressed concern about the long-term implications. One Hollywood insider, known for their close ties to the couple, remarked, "This isn't just another tabloid story. This is something people saw with their own eyes. If they don't address it properly, it's going to follow them for a long time." As the night wore on, the pressure on Harry and Meghan mounted. Would they issue a statement? Would they appear together before the event ended? Or would Harry's departure from Meghan's side mark a turning point in their public and private relationship? For now, the world could only wait. As the world processed the footage, the situation grew more complicated by the hour. Commentators, body language experts, and social media users dissected every angle of the video, scrutinizing Meghan's expression, Harry's reaction, and the dynamics at play. The discussion had extended beyond the immediate moment. This was now a referendum on their entire relationship. Inside the Invictus Games venue, the reality of the fallout was settling in. While Meghan continued her engagements, her team worked behind the scenes to manage the situation. Messages were exchanged with media allies, calls were made, and efforts were underway to influence the framing of the story. But there was no consensus on the best approach. One faction within her circle believed in outright denial. "Call it a misunderstanding," one advisor suggested. "Make it about cultural differences. Maybe say she was gesturing passionately, and it was misinterpreted." Another approach was more defensive. "If we acknowledge anything, it needs to be framed in a way that makes Meghan the sympathetic figure. Say she was frustrated about something unrelated, and the moment was taken out of context." But neither strategy addressed the elephant in the room. Prince Harry's reaction. He hadn't laughed it off. He hadn't stayed by Meghan's side. He had walked away, his face betraying something deeper than momentary embarrassment. Inside the VIP lounge, Harry remained withdrawn. He had turned his phone over to avoid the inevitable flood of messages and calls. He knew what was happening out there. He knew how these things worked. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't care about the optics. He didn't care about controlling the narrative. His thoughts drifted to his past, to the days when his life had been defined by duty and tradition. He had spent years pushing back against the institution, trying to carve out an identity separate from the expectations placed upon him. And yet, despite all his efforts, he was still a man trapped in the public eye, his life still dictated by forces beyond his control. A quiet knock at the door disrupted his thoughts. He considered ignoring it, but ultimately decided against it. "Come in." The door opened slowly, and to his mild surprise, it was one of the senior organizers of the Invictus Games. A woman he had known for years, someone who had worked alongside him in making this event a reality. "Harry," she said gently, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "I just wanted to check on you." He forced a small smile. "I appreciate that." She hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Look, I know you don't need advice, but I also know how much this event means to you. And right now, the focus is shifting away from what really matters." He sighed, running a hand over his face. "I didn't plan for this." "I know," she said, her voice calm, "but you have a choice. You can let this moment define the games, or you can reclaim it." Harry looked away, staring at the floor for a long moment. He understood what she was saying. He knew that if he didn't return, if he allowed this incident to overshadow everything, it would be a disservice to the competitors, to the very people he had built this platform for. After a pause, he nodded. "I'll be out soon." She smiled, squeezing his shoulder briefly before exiting. Meanwhile, outside, the media circus was in full swing. News agencies debated how the royal family might react, if they would react at all. Some speculated that this was a turning point for Harry and Meghan's public image, while others dismissed it as another overblown controversy. But regardless of interpretation, one thing was clear. This moment had exposed something raw, something real. And then, just as the speculation reached its peak, a shift occurred. Prince Harry re-emerged. His return to the main event did not go unnoticed. As he stepped back into the arena, the cameras found him instantly. The audience, many of whom had been aware of the earlier tension, watched closely. But there was no dramatic entrance, no grand statement. He simply walked in, took his seat, and focused on the competition. For some, this was a sign that he was moving past the incident, that he was refusing to let it define the evening. But for those who looked closer, there was something else, a distance in his demeanor, a weight in his expression that hadn't been there before. Seated not far from him, Meghan remained composed. She glanced in his direction once, but did not acknowledge him directly. Whether this was intentional or not was up for debate. But the divide between them was evident. As the night went on, the games continued, and the world watched, waiting for the next development. The next moment that might reveal what was truly happening beneath the surface. Would Harry and Meghan address the incident publicly? Would there be a joint statement, a carefully crafted response? Or would they simply move forward, hoping the story would fade? As the night unfolded, the tension within the stadium remained, invisible yet palpable. Those who had witnessed the incident firsthand whispered amongst themselves, exchanging theories and speculations. The footage had already made its way onto news broadcasts and social media platforms, and the world was now weighing in on what it all meant. Prince Harry sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the competition, though it was evident that his mind was elsewhere. He had always prided himself on maintaining control of his emotions in public, but this time was different. He felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on him, each one dissecting his every move. The cameras zoomed in periodically, capturing his distant expression, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped against his knee in an unconscious display of agitation. Meanwhile, Meghan continued her interactions with attendees, her public persona as polished as ever. If she felt any discomfort from the situation, she did not show it. She engaged with athletes, exchanged pleasantries with officials, and even managed to flash a few perfectly timed smiles for the cameras. But to those paying close attention, there was something missing, an ease, a natural flow to her interactions that had once been effortless. The Invictus Games staff had done their best to shift the focus back to the athletes, to ensure that the event was not completely overshadowed by the unfolding drama. Announcers kept their commentary professional, avoiding any mention of the controversy, but there was no denying the growing chatter among the spectators. In the royal watching world, commentators were already preparing their analyses. Was this a momentary lapse in judgment on Meghan's part, or was it indicative of a deeper rift between her and Harry? Theories ranged from stress-related tension to marital discord to the pressures of public life taking their toll. Some defended Meghan, arguing that the footage could be misinterpreted, while others speculated that this was only the tip of the iceberg. The British media, in particular, seized the moment. Headlines from prominent newspapers dissected every aspect of the incident, from body language to the possible consequences for Harry's relationship with the royal family. One article from a major publication read, "Is Prince Harry reaching his breaking point? Royal experts weigh in." Another headline took a more direct approach, "The moment that changed everything. What Meghan Markle's public slap means for the Sussexes." Even tabloids, known for their sensationalist takes, were running wild with theories. A particularly dramatic piece speculated that Harry might soon return to the United Kingdom permanently, leaving behind the life he had built with Meghan in California. Of course, not all coverage was critical. Some commentators argued that the moment was being blown out of proportion, that it was nothing more than a misunderstanding caught on camera. A few of Meghan's staunch supporters pushed back against the criticism, accusing the media of unfairly targeting her yet again. But the undeniable truth remained. This moment had ignited a conversation that could not be ignored. Behind closed doors, Meghan's team was still working tirelessly to control the narrative. Advisors debated whether or not she should address the incident directly. Some believed that silence was the best strategy, that addressing it would only give the story more traction. Others argued that a carefully worded statement could help shape public perception. One strategist suggested an informal response, perhaps through a trusted journalist or a friendly media outlet. We need to get ahead of this, they insisted. If we let the media control the story, we lose the ability to shape it. But Meghan herself was not convinced. She had weathered countless media storms before, and in her experience, the best approach was often to simply move forward as if nothing had happened. We stick to the plan, she said firmly. No statements, no responses. This will pass. Her team exchanged uncertain glances, but ultimately, her word was final. Meanwhile, in Buckingham Palace, the news had already reached the highest levels. The royal family had long since grown accustomed to controversies involving Harry and Meghan, but this was different. Unlike past incidents, which had often been driven by media speculation or anonymous sources, this was something caught on film, something undeniable. Prince William, upon being informed of the incident, reportedly remained quiet for several moments before offering a simple response. He's made his choices. King Charles, on the other hand, was said to be more concerned about the long-term implications. An aide, speaking anonymously to the press, revealed that the palace was taking a wait-and-see approach but was fully aware of the potential fallout. The king has always hoped for reconciliation, but moments like this make it increasingly difficult, the aide said. As the night drew on, Harry remained at the event, though he and Meghan continued to keep their distance from one another. He clapped when appropriate, nodded in acknowledgement when spoken to, but there was an unmistakable detachment to his demeanor. Those who knew him well could see it. Something had shifted. At one point, a former Invictus Games competitor approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You all right, mate?" Harry offered a tight smile. "Yeah, just taking it all in." But the truth was, he wasn't all right. He hadn't been for a while. The weight of everything, the pressures of his marriage, the constant media scrutiny, the distance from his family, was pressing down on him in a way that felt inescapable. And for the first time in a long while, he found himself questioning everything. The night eventually came to an end, with Meghan leaving the venue first, flanked by her team. Harry remained behind for a while longer, shaking hands with competitors, offering quiet words of encouragement to those who had participated. But when he finally left, he did so alone. As he stepped into the black SUV waiting for him outside, he let out a long breath. He knew that tomorrow would bring even more speculation, more questions, more analysis of what had transpired. But for now, all he wanted was silence. The car pulled away, and with it, the lingering echoes of the night's events. But the world was not done talking. Not yet. As the SUV carrying Prince Harry moved through the quiet streets of Vancouver, the hum of the engine was the only sound breaking the silence. He sat in the back seat, his fingers resting against his temple, his thoughts a tangled web of emotions. The evening had been a disaster in ways he had never anticipated. He had prepared for media attention, for the pressures of being at such a high-profile event, but never for something so deeply personal to unravel in front of the entire world. The driver, a seasoned professional accustomed to handling high-profile clients, remained silent. He had seen this look before, on politicians, celebrities, and once, on a former prime minister who had just endured a public scandal. It was the look of someone grappling with a moment they could never take back. As the vehicle navigated through the dimly lit streets, Harry glanced at his phone. He had turned it off earlier to avoid the immediate fallout, but now, as he pressed the power button, he watched as the screen flooded with notifications. Missed calls from close friends, text messages from trusted confidants, emails from advisors, and then the headlines, each more damning than the last. The night that changed everything. Meghan Markle's public slap leaves Prince Harry humiliated. Royal expert. This is the most public display of disrespect we've seen in years. Body language analysts break down the Sussex rift. What comes next? Harry exhaled sharply and locked the screen without opening a single message. He already knew what they would say. He already knew what the world had decided. But for once, he wasn't sure what his next move should be. Meanwhile, Meghan was already back at their hotel, her team in a flurry of activity. The damage control efforts were in full swing, with calls being placed to media contacts, PR specialists debating the best response, and a carefully crafted narrative already being shaped behind the scenes. But Meghan, ever the strategist, had made one thing clear. There would be no official statement. This is just another media frenzy, she had told her closest advisors. It will pass. One of her top aides hesitated before responding. With all due respect, this isn't like the other times. There's footage, and people are reacting differently. They're not just criticizing you. They're worried about him. Meghan's jaw tightened. That's because they want to paint me as the villain. They always have. Her aide sighed, knowing there was no point in pressing further. Meghan had always been adamant that the media was against her, and in many ways, she wasn't wrong. But this situation was different. This time, the reaction wasn't just about media bias. It was about something people had seen with their own eyes. In London, Buckingham Palace was in crisis mode. While the royal family had long since distanced itself from Harry and Meghan's controversies, the fact that this moment had been so public meant that it was impossible to ignore. Senior aides gathered for an emergency discussion, debating whether or not to issue a statement. "We do not comment on personal matters," one advisor reminded the group. "But this is different," another countered. "The public is drawing their own conclusions, and if this continues, it could reflect poorly on the family as a whole. The last thing we need is for people to start questioning Harry's well-being." A decision was ultimately made to remain silent, but internally, there was growing concern. Prince William, ever pragmatic, reportedly took a more measured approach. "He'll either find a way to fix this, or he won't," he told a close friend. "Either way, it's not our problem anymore." But King Charles was not as indifferent. While his relationship with Harry had been strained in recent years, he still held hope that his son would find his way back. And for the first time in a long time, he considered reaching out. Back in Vancouver, Harry finally arrived at the hotel. He stepped out of the vehicle without a word, ignoring the flashes of cameras from persistent paparazzi who had been waiting outside. He walked straight through the entrance, past the lobby, and into the elevator without stopping. When he reached the suite, he hesitated for just a moment before pushing the door open. Meghan was inside, standing near the window, her arms crossed. She turned when she heard him enter, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Finally, Meghan broke the silence. "So, what now?" Harry let out a slow breath. He didn't have an answer. Not yet. But one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same after tonight. And as the world continued to watch, waiting for their next move, the cracks in their carefully constructed public image had never been more visible. As the tension hung heavy in the air between them, Meghan turned away from Harry and looked out the hotel window. The city lights reflected against the glass, a stark contrast to the storm that was brewing inside their suite. Outside, the world continued as if nothing had happened. Inside, everything felt like it was unraveling. Harry remained by the door, his posture rigid. He had imagined countless moments of confrontation throughout his life. Arguments with the press, disputes within the royal family, the challenges of forging a new identity outside of the monarchy, but he had never imagined this. The silence between them stretched unbearably, filled with everything they wanted to say but couldn't. Meghan was the first to speak again. "This is exactly what they wanted," she said, her voice measured but laced with frustration. Harry frowned. "Who?" "The media. The palace. The people who have been waiting for an opportunity to turn you against me." She turned to face him now, her expression unreadable. "You do realize that, don't you?" Harry let out a slow breath, pressing his hands against his temples. "Meghan, this isn't about them. It's about what happened. You hit me. In front of cameras. In front of people." Her jaw tightened. "I didn't hit you. It was—" "Don't," he interrupted, his voice low. "Don't try to spin this. You know what happened." She folded her arms, exhaling sharply. "You embarrassed me." Harry stared at her in disbelief. "I embarrassed you?" "You interrupted me," she snapped, "in the middle of an important conversation. In front of people. Do you have any idea how that made me look?" Harry shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "So, this is about how you looked?" Meghan's expression didn't change. "It's always about how I look. How we look. We don't have the luxury of making mistakes, Harry. You know that." Harry stepped forward, his frustration finally boiling over. "No, Meghan. You don't have the luxury of admitting when you're wrong. That's the problem. A flicker of something, anger, maybe hurt, crossed her face, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. So, what? You want me to grovel? To apologize on live television? Is that what you want? Harry sighed, running a hand through his hair. I want honesty. I want to know that this, us, isn't just some performance for the cameras. Meghan's face hardened. You think this is a performance? Sometimes, yes, he admitted. And tonight was the first time I saw it so clearly. She turned away from him again, her posture stiff. If that's how you feel, maybe you should go back to London. Maybe that's where you belong. The words hit him harder than he expected. London. The place he had fought so hard to leave. The place where he had felt like a prisoner in his own life. And yet, standing here now, he wasn't sure where he belonged anymore. He took a deep breath. I don't know what I'm going to do, he admitted. But I do know that I can't keep pretending everything is fine when it isn't. Meghan didn't respond. She remained by the window, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. Harry turned toward the door, his heart pounding. He needed air. He needed space. Without another word, he grabbed his coat and walked out, leaving Meghan alone in the silence. As the door closed behind him, she finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time, she felt something unfamiliar, uncertainty. And as Harry stepped out into the cool night air, he realized that this was the first time in a long while that he didn't know what his next step would be. The world was watching, but for the first time, he didn't care. All he knew was that something had changed, and there was no going back. As Harry stepped out into the quiet night, the air felt different, thicker, heavier. The noise from the bustling streets of Vancouver seemed distant, almost muffled against the weight of his thoughts. He had spent so many years crafting a new life, one separate from the expectations of royalty, yet here he was, feeling just as trapped as before. For a moment, he simply stood there, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his coat, his breath visible in the cold. He had nowhere to go, no plan, no agenda. He just needed to be away. He started walking, not in any particular direction, but with the sole purpose of clearing his mind. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional pedestrian or late-night driver. No one seemed to recognize him, or if they did, they were too polite to approach. It was a rare moment of anonymity, something he had craved for most of his life. But now, instead of feeling liberating, it felt isolating. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. He wasn't ready to talk to anyone. He wasn't even sure who he would call if he did. Back at the hotel, Meghan remained by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She hated losing control of a situation, and tonight had spiraled far beyond anything she had anticipated. She told herself that it wasn't her fault, that Harry had been the one to provoke her, that the cameras had exaggerated everything. But deep down, a sliver of doubt crept in. What if this time, things didn't blow over? Her phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from her team, from journalists looking for a comment, from allies asking what the strategy would be. But the only call she was waiting for, the one from Harry, never came. As the hours passed, the news cycle continued to churn. The video of their confrontation had now spread across every major platform, dissected from every possible angle. Analysts debated what it meant, whether this was a sign of a deeper rift, whether Harry would finally reconsider the choices he had made over the last few years. In London, Buckingham Palace was eerily quiet. There would be no official response, but that didn't mean there weren't discussions happening behind closed doors. King Charles had received the briefing, and while he refrained from making any public comment, those close to him noticed the concern etched into his face. This isn't just another scandal, one aide remarked privately. This is different. Prince William, on the other hand, remained as detached as ever. To those who asked, his response was simple. Harry made his bed, he said to a confidant. Now he has to lie in it. But not everyone was as indifferent. A close friend of Harry's, someone who had known him long before his life had become a spectacle, reached out with a simple message. You don't have to do this alone. Harry read the message but didn't respond. Not yet. As dawn approached, he found himself near the waterfront, staring out at the stillness of the sea. He had spent his entire life running, from expectations, from scrutiny, from the pain of his past. But now, for the first time, he wasn't sure what he was running toward, and that terrified him. As the city began to wake, he knew he had a choice to make. Would he go back? Or was it finally time to walk away for good? Harry remained at the waterfront, staring into the endless stretch of water before him. The city was waking up behind him, but he remained frozen in place, his thoughts an endless loop of questions with no clear answers. He had spent the last few years convincing himself that he had found freedom, that leaving the royal family had been the right choice, that building a new life with Meghan was worth every sacrifice. But standing here now, with everything unraveling around him, he wasn't so sure anymore. For years, he had fought to prove that he could exist outside of the monarchy's rigid structure, that he could carve out his own identity without the weight of tradition suffocating him. But was he truly free? Or had he simply traded one cage for another? His phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. He hesitated before glancing at the screen. A message from an unknown number flashed across it. "Harry, come home." He stared at the words, his chest tightening. He didn't need to ask who it was from. There was only one person who would say those words so simply, so directly. William. He exhaled sharply, locking the phone without responding. Going back to London had never seemed like an option before. It had always been a line he refused to cross, a past he had sworn never to return to. But now, he wasn't so sure. As he stood there, lost in thought, Meghan was pacing inside their hotel suite. She had barely slept. Her mind had been racing all night, trying to anticipate what would happen next. She knew Harry was angry, humiliated even, but he would come back. He always did. That was how their arguments worked. She would push, he would pull away, but eventually, he would return, and they would move on. But something felt different this time. He had been gone for hours, and the longer he stayed away, the more uneasy she felt. She finally grabbed her phone and dialed his number. It rang once, twice, 3 times, then went to voicemail. Her grip on the phone tightened. He was ignoring her. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to not being in control. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Buckingham Palace remained silent on the matter, but behind closed doors, the conversations continued. The royal family had long since washed their hands of Harry's decisions, but this incident had changed things. It was one thing for him to be at odds with them. It was another thing entirely for the world to see him like this, isolated, humiliated, lost. Senior aides debated whether the palace should extend a quiet invitation for Harry to return to London, at least temporarily. The optics of it all were undeniable. If he stayed in Vancouver, and this story continued to spiral, it would only fuel further speculation. But if he returned, even briefly, it could signal stability, a sign that he still had a place within the royal fold. But William's message had already said what needed to be said. Come home. Harry sat down on a bench by the water, his mind swirling with possibilities. Could he go back? Would it even change anything? Or was it too late? As he stared out at the horizon, he realized he didn't have an answer. But for the first time in a long while, he was starting to ask the right questions.